Hey everybody, and welcome to Industry Night with me, Nycci Nellis, the show that takes you on a real deep dive of all things in the industry. Now, sometimes there are passion projects, and sometimes there are travel trends, and sometimes there's somebody just making jam around the corner. Whatever it is, it all comes back to the industry. And for those of you who are new here, hi, thanks for joining me. A little bit about myself. I've been covering the DC food, wine, and hospitality scene for the last 20 years. You can check out the listeareyouwantit.com, the online e-zine that tells you about every food, wine, event happening, beer, cocktails, you name it, in the DC metro area, every opening, every restaurant coming soon, and every promotion that every restaurant is doing. Of course, you follow me at NYCCI, NELLIS, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and yes, on LinkedIn too. I guess I have to do that too, because social media is a cluster and I got to do it. But there you can stay on top of all of my travel and eating journeys, excuse me. Let's see what else. Oh, yeah, every Sunday, Foodie and the Beast, 14 years, my husband and I have been on air, the only food and wine variety show in DC. And then lastly, here I am at the gorgeous WineLair. I'm so fortunate back in November, started this incredible partnership with Hardcast Media and the WineLair. Here we are, right next to the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Washington, D.C. I'm totally in my element per usual because I'm surrounded by lots of wine, and that's where I like to be. So let's get into what's happening. So, per usual, out and about, having a good time. And I think I say this every week, but the city is busy. And not just the city, like everywhere. There's just a buzz in the air. I sort of wish I could bottle it up like a bottle of champagne and sort of keep it with me to keep that sort of radiant energy going. And let me just tell you about some of the places I went to. Okay, so Chef Marcel Affron, has launched his Shababi pop-up. It's at, part of the name of the place, but it's called Please Bring Chips. That's the, I know, it's a funky, cool space. And it's on 8th Street Northeast. And they're doing a pop-up there for the next 6 weeks. Shababi is all Palestinian food. So think hummus and this Palestinian chicken and amazing za'atar-covered fries. Anyway, it's so good. Please go out there and support them. I just love them. And then no big deal. You know, Saturday night, just hanging with Gordon Ramsay at the new Hell's Kitchen in the Wharf. Huge, huge, huge party. And if you weren't invited, I mean, maybe you're just not on the right list. No, I'm joking. I was invited. It was very exciting to be there. And it was a real who's who of the DC hospitality industry, writers, and couple of socialite people, but it was cool to see him. The space is really gorgeous. It's not cheap, people. So originally I thought it was going to be more of a tourist spot, but I think a lot of tourists are going to walk in there, look at the menu, and walk right out. So give it a month or two, and I think you're going to see a lot of DCers going there. And the views, I mean, it's the Wharf. The views are spectacular. This is so humbling. I was so honored to be on Jenna Golden and Tammy Gordon's podcast, The Movable Feast. It's such a fabulous show. So if you don't know Jenna and Tammy, they are two personalities around town, and they, first of all, travel like crazy and they eat everywhere. So this is an in on all the fabulous places they're eating and or traveling. And sometimes they bring on a guest, and this time they brought in May. So Jenna talked about actually eating at Rose's Bakery, which is a fabulous bakery here in DC. Tammy was in Tampa, and she talked about some of her incredible eats. And I have to say, Tampa wasn't really on my list of must-hit places, but I don't know, maybe a field trip is in order. And then I decided to go out of the country completely and talked about my trip to Sardinia and some of the incredible feasts that I had there. So their information will be in the show notes. Please check it out, tune in and listen, and subscribe to them as well as subscribe to me, both on YouTube and on this podcast platform. So lastly, last night, I was greeted incredibly and seated at Nick Stefanelli's new restaurant, Le Clou, which is in the Morrow Hotel over in the Union Market District. Now, you can see the champagne here. Last night, I was elevated a little bit. I was greeted with some Dom Perignon, which was lovely, and caviar, which was even better. And Nick, who is known really for Greek, Mediterranean, and Italian food, is serving up French. The space is really spectacular. I think like a higher end brasserie. Great food. There's a gorgeous rooftop area, a great bar area. All of it is sort of slow rolling open, but I think you're going to see a lot coming from him in the coming weeks. And actually, he'll be on the show March 2nd. So stay tuned for that. Okay. What else have I got? Oh, I got today's show. So this is a total blast from the past. Well, my past for me. So I met Matthew Carroll, so long ago. It's making me age just thinking about it. But I believe we met when he was a sommelier at 2941. He was a very well-known sommelier already. He started at he didn't start at, but where I know him from is at the Storied Inn at Little Washington, right before 2941. And then he kind of moved around DC a bit. He was at quite a few places. And then all of a sudden, poof, he disappeared. And this wasn't a pandemic thing. Like, this is a while ago. Like, all of a sudden, he was gone. I don't know where he was. But here's what I know now. He is with Skurnik Wines and Spirits, which is a family business that has been around since the 80s. And now, not only are Matt and I going to catch up as we learn more about his wine journey, but he brought in bubbles, which you all know I always love because I love the bubbles. So we're going to talk about Matt. We're going to get the who, what, where, why, when. And then we're going to talk about champagne because there is a lot of new intel that you need to know to consume it well. Yeah. All right. So, and I'm seriously regretting driving already to the WineLair today. So, hi, Matt. It's so good to see you too.
In the same room together.
How are you?
I am doing incredibly well.
That is
so happy and yeah.
I mean, I will be honest. You have not changed a bit. Maybe a little grayer.
I would say so.
Other than that, I mean, I could pick you out of a crowd. You look amazing.
Thank you.
So let's talk shop.
Please.
How did you get into wine? I mean, it's not like everybody can just walk up to the Inn at Little Washington and be like, I would like to be pouring your wines for you today.
Right. No, and it was a little bit of luck, a little bit of hard work, and all those cool components coming together. But I fell backwards into wine, like I think a lot of wine professionals do. It was a second career for me. I was a school teacher for almost 10 years before I got into this, and working at a special ed school was amazing and
exhausting.
Uh-huh. The easy joke now is it drove you to drink. So therefore, they didn't let me do it before. Now they encourage me.
Uh-huh.
But no, unfortunately in this country, it's hard to make a living as a school teacher with one income like that. So I'd been playing music in a band, which was a lot of fun, but was too busy for a school teacher's life. Like getting home, 3-4 nights a week, way late, and then having to wake back up and teach in the morning was tough. So still needed to make some money. I had a friend who worked at a wine bar in Baltimore and said, hey, you should, we need somebody else. You should come and meet the owner and check this out.
But did you know about wines? Did you have an interest in wines?
I would say at that point, I enjoyed wine. I didn't really grow up in a house that drank a lot of wine. But I grew up in a very food-driven house. Like we cooked a lot together. We ate a lot together.
That is exactly how I grew up. So like my parents are not drinkers at all. Although my mom does drink a little bit more now than she used to. But like she used to order Harvey's Bristol Cream.
Right.
I mean, that's what she would order at a bar and barely drink it. And my dad has never been, but we were a food focused family, very food focused.
And it's the same way. So wine was always around, but it was never a big thing. But I've always, my light on my gravestone one day may say his hobby was collecting hobbies. And I've always liked just learning stuff and picking up new things. And
do you want to know what's going to be on my gravestone?
Please.
I've already decided. It's going to say, she was Jesse's girl.
All along.
Right?
All right.
Here she is.
We solved the story. We solved the mystery.
My husband's like, that's stupid. I'm like, no, there will be
enough people are going to
like get that joke.
Enough people.
My generation will get it. Right. Anyway, so how did you advance your wine education?
So I got very lucky. When the place is actually still there called Grand Cru. It's in Belvedere Square in Baltimore, and was owned
a very
by,
well respected.
It
place.
is. It is, and what for the longest time was owned and run by a gent named Nelson Carey. Nelson, who I would consider forever my first and most important mentor. He passed away a few years back, unfortunately. But he, when I walked in, I guess he saw some ability there, and I was interested. And he essentially said, if you want to take any of these Court of Master Sommelier exams, I'll pay for them. I'll reimburse you for them.
Well, that's amazing.
Yeah. But
that's no easy task. Lots of people do the WSET and like start the process, but if we can just give people a sort of in on what like, listen, there's always like a lot of chatter out there about sommeliers that like, they're judgy and they're difficult. And I mean, listen, we know a lot of the same people and I love them, but sometimes they're rough on me. And
absolutely.
I'm like, hey, I'm your friend.
Right.
But so what goes into that education? Like, what does it take to get to the certain levels? What level are you at? And how does it all come together?
In that program, in the Court of Master Sommeliers program, there are 4 levels, so to speak. There's an introductory course. Then there's a certification, so the certified sommelier. Okay. And then there's the advanced exam, and then the master exam. Okay. So, and
you're a master?
No, I've sat the master exam enough times now to know a lot about that process, but no, I have not passed that exam.
I hear it's brutal.
It's pretty rough. It's itty bitty pass rate. Fewer people have been in space, or fewer people have passed it than have been in space, like that kind of stuff, like wacky statistics. So, but yeah, I got very lucky. Went through the first 2 pretty quickly, and then kind of had this, studying for the advanced exam, and that was really interesting. And that's actually what brought me down to DC more, because there was no real wine community for like exam prep in Baltimore.
No, there's a huge one here.
Massive.
Right? Massive.
Yeah. So I was driving down a couple times a week to taste.
Who used to lead it? Was it Andy?
Andy Myers.
Andy Myers.
John Waybeck. Kathy Morgan. God. So it was Kathy, John, and Andy, and Jared Slip really were the I
just saw Jared.
Oh, cool. Last week. Yeah. They were really kind of the 4 that really were moving this thing in DC and had a really active tasting group and study community and welcomed me in coming down from Baltimore. And which was wonderful. So that kind of really helped me get ready for that exam. And even the advanced exam had a really low pass rate. So I was like, well, if I pass this thing in my first shot, I'll quit my day job and do wine full time, having no expectation to do so. Okay. And then I did, and I was like, damn it.
So what do you need? Okay, so wait, but let's just, for people who don't know, what do you need to do to pass that? So regions.
Oh yeah.
Like if you could give me like 4 key components.
Yeah,
of what you need.
They actually break most of these exams up into a few different parts. Like so you've got a theory exam, which is like the trivia component, and that can be regions, that can be what grapes are grown where, climatic conditions, a lot of cultural stuff. It can be about food and wine too, which is interesting. It can be about tea. It can be about coffee. It can be about anything that you might serve in a restaurant setting. And that's. At the advanced level is all done as a written exam, and at the master level, it's all done orally. And then you've got a blind tasting component. So you're put 6 wines in front of you, 3 white, 3 red, and you've got a set amount of time to describe those wines to the panel sitting in front of you and making your deductive case of why this wine in the glass is what it is.
Now, are you supposed to, how granular do you need to get? Are you supposed to give like the year and the actual maker? So not just the grape, but like, are you supposed to be like, it's Veuve Clicquot? I mean,
essentially you're supposed to, for most of that, and a lot of it does kind of build on the case that you've built above it, so to speak. But your conclusion should be a vintage, which you can kind of get, you can get within a range usually, depending on what the wine is. Then the variety, the region, sub-region, quality level. And sometimes you probably wouldn't do this in exam settings, but like a lot of times in tasting groups, somebody will be like, feel so confident about something, they'll call a producer. They'll say like, I think this is such and such. I think this is so-and-so's wine, which is
pretty ballsy.
When it's right, it's pretty cool. When it's not, which is most of the time, it's like, oh, well, whatever. But so yeah, you've got that piece where you're building this case for these wines. And a lot of that, people are like, oh, well, that's the part that's, the hardest. But in a way, like you can train for that and learn that just like anybody, like any other thing.
But I think you're training a muscle that most people don't think about training.
And maybe even more
so.
You are, but you're also really training your lexicon and and connecting that to sense memory is really what I think the biggest piece of that is how that works. At least for me, has always been recognizing something when I pick a wine up and making those connections internally to be able to say the right things to get the points, quote unquote.
Right.
So it's a little bit of there's just like anything, it's a bit of a gamesmanship sort of thing. Blind tasting I think can be really helpful in the wine world. It's also a little bit of a parlor trick, quite admittedly.
We had Bill Jensen.
I listened to that one. Yeah.
And, that was really fun.
And Bill's a great taster too. Bill's just aside from being an amazing guy, he's a fantastic wine taster.
So let's talk about, then how do you take all that education, quit your day job, and how do you go to the Inn of Little Washington, sort of the crown jewel, one of the greatest wine lists in the country.
Yeah.
One of several, but one of them. And how do you go about interacting? Because I assume one of the things that they don't teach you in that training is how you communicate with people to pour them a wine. Because the hospitality part is not part of your training.
Right. There is a service component to the exams.
Oh, is there?
Yep. You literally do table service.
Oh, I didn't
You're
realize
opening
that.
wine for people. You're they're asking questions. It very much is like a mock service. Like you're, but I've seen and heard stories about folks that, there's a lot of, in that piece of the test, there's definitely a lot of subjectivity. So your hospitality and how you actually want to take care of that guest at even your mock fake table there is worth something. And I think that's something that there's stories of really fantastic sommeliers going through these exams and being so cold and stern and just going through the motions that they lose those points, so to speak. And then there's folks, I think, on the other side of it where I've heard of people just, dropping a whole tray of glasses, but they recover so well and they're so gracious that they still do well. So I think you're right, though. It's hard that's a piece of it that's really tough and especially tough to learn and teach people.
Well, and I think that it's, as a diner and a voyeur, if you will, of the industry, I think... let's talk about the different, you were at 2941 and the Inn at Little Washington, both sort of white tablecloth, higher end dinings. But then you go to Bravo, which they may have had white tablecloths, but you know what I mean? So you have to take your wine chatter to the level of the clientele and the feel of the property you're at.
Absolutely. And I think that comes in maybe even more granular level of realizing that every guest you approach, not just every table, but every guest at that table, you should sort of be thinking about how best can I explain what I'm trying to get across to that person.
Right.
I think and to do so in a kind way that actually is, giving them information and letting them feel empowered by your wine list and that sort of stuff. There's a lot of fun pieces within that part of hospitality that I think either people who are really great at it either think about it constantly or it's just so natural that they don't think about it at all. And it's just how they work.
Well, and I think also it's reading the room. There are people who really want to chat wine.
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean? This is what I like. And I'm not familiar with what's on the list. Walk me through it. And then there are people who and you and I both know people like this who are okay, I'm cool with spending $100. I'll take that wine. It's $100. That's what I want to spend. Do you know what I mean? And I think as a somm, sort of straddling all that is 100%. Tough.
It really is. And like you said, every guest is different. Every experience is different. Every sort of interaction within a group of guests is a little can be interesting to play with and observe. But you're right. Sometimes you get the sort of business guy who wants to show off a little bit. And it's my job to help him do that.
Right.
It's the same for somebody who comes in and is they want to have a nice night. They're on a budget. We can still get you something super cool and that you're going to be so excited about just as much as the guy who spent 15 times more than you across the room. It doesn't matter. We're going to get you a great experience and you're going to have an awesome bottle of wine.
Right. Just because it's $30, let's say, it doesn't mean it's not a good bottle of wine. It's still on the list.
And I think most sommeliers who have a lot of say in the wines that they get to pour will mostly come back to saying, I picked the $30 bottle of wine just like I picked the $3,000 bottle of wine. It's on the wine list for a reason. Like, I think this wine's cool for a reason.
I love that you said that. I will tell you, when the Source opened and Wolfgang Puck's brother, Klaus, put the wine list together, and we went with friends.
Right.
Who we're not really friends with anymore. And he was into wine, and he was looking at the list, and he was puffing up his chest, and he was like, Nick, he's like, there's not a wine worth drinking on this list under $500. I was like, really, Brian? I was like, see, that's Klaus Puck over there. I was like, you
might know something.
I was like, you want me to bring him over? You want to tell him that the wine list you put together is shit?
It's all terrible.
I'm totally happy to have that conversation with you and him. Like, I'm here for it. I was like, I don't have my microphone with me, but can I make this happen for you? So I think that's such a valid point. Like, it's on the list for a reason.
Right. And there's fantastic, especially, I think, right now, I think and I think about this, and I probably say it in some way every couple of years, is that, like, this is the best time to be drinking wine. This is the best time to be drinking wine, because there is incredible stuff at every price point. Like, you can find, no matter what category, you can really, like, zero into, like, I want to spend this much money at a retail shop or this much money on a wine list, and you can do it and taste almost anything you really want to try, which is so cool.
I agree with you. And I do think it's an amazing time as a layperson to drink wine, because regionally, not only does every state in this country produce wine, which is, not all of them should, but it's still really cool. But, we're drinking wines from South America. We're drinking wines from Georgia, the country, and Hungary, and India is producing, and Israel has great wines. Like, all these places, listen, what I knew when I was young was, like, French, Italian, maybe some Spanish, California. And, 30 years ago, Virginia was like a joke.
Exactly.
And now, the wine's coming out of Virginia.
World-class wine.
Yeah. It's really, it's such a great time to be drinking.
Absolutely.
Really, or Greek wine. Like, I'm just thinking of all the regions.
I'll say there's so many, and not only is, like, there's this massive swath of any country you can think of and any style you can think of, but, like I said, thankfully, I think most between, like, great importers, great distributors, especially in a market like this, we have access to all of it. Like, we can get at every price point. Like, we can find $15 versions of cool Greek wine and find $15 version, or spend a bunch more if that's what you feel like doing.
The hardest part is, for either in retail or at the restaurant, is, if I say, if I'm in a restaurant, I say, listen, I love a Mount Etna red.
Right.
Like, that's my jam. That's what I want. But you don't have anything like that here. What you got? Right. And that's, to me,
but that little bit of information, like, that says a lot, like, about what stylistically you might look for. Like, say that sommelier is running a program that is, or that retailer has a shop that is more focused on something else. Just knowing that, like, those things about that flavor profile and that kind of idea, they'll find something from wherever they've got wine from. Like, even if it's an all domestic list, or
Sicily,
it's exactly. There's so much cool stuff that'll hit a lot of those same kind of hits for you. Check a lot of those boxes for you without being from Italy.
Right.
Yeah. No. So I think there was a big, although almost a rewind back to when we jumped back to the inn and stuff like that. It was almost like the biggest culture. It was more of a culture shock, because I had come from this wine bar setting where everything was so familial, and, like, it's funny. I'll still find myself, and I'll still hear myself, like, my internal, alarm go off when a server, even in a great restaurant, will say something like, "Are you guys okay?" I still remember the first time I think I said something like that, and the maitre d' of the restaurant pulled me aside in the most, like, kind and refined way possible, and said, "We don't call our guests guys." And I was like, "Heard, chef." So very much but it's one of those where you become it's such a simple thing that in most places it's a familial kind of, like,
the
disarming
thing about the Inn at Little Washington, I think what people are most surprised by, aside from, like, the eye candy everywhere, because, like, the decor, like, everything, it's like, so everywhere you look, you're like, oh my god, but is that the service is not fussy.
No,
it is not
cold.
My pleasure. It is kind of kind of whimsical.
It
and kind
is.
of fun.
Yep.
Very Patrick, obviously.
Sure.
But, the cow is being pushed around
yes.
with the cheese.
Most
and
definitely.
The guy who serves it is always telling the cheesiest jokes.
Yes.
It's such a... what I love about it, like if you think of a movie like The Menu
Mm-hmm.
and like all those like super intense tweezery chefs, no judgment. I love
Right,
them.
sure.
Love you guys. Love you. But there is a joy
Right.
and a reminder in that restaurant
Mhm.
that what you're doing is a pleasure.
Yes.
Food and wine are pleasures to be
Absolutely.
had, and it should not be intense and serious, and it should be enjoyed.
I agree. And in retrospect, I think that was a big takeaway from that experience that I tried to take through to all other parts of my world. It was that it didn't matter necessarily that this was this incredibly refined and amazing dining room, but that at the end of it, you were there to make the guest happy, and you were there to like just provide this really nice experience for people.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I just really think that can be brought to anything else you're doing. Like there's so many lessons that can be kind of taken from that. And
we have a book now for Patrick O'Connell.
Yes.
Lessons from the End.
Lessons from the End.
Okay, but let's move forward. So you do the Somm thing.
Yeah.
You hit it hard.
Yep.
And then where'd you go?
What
happened? What happened?
It was, I hit one of those moments where I'd been sitting for the master exam a bunch. But it was going through a little bit of a career. What does this all mean phase? Mm-hmm. And, had no real interest in leaving the restaurant industry, but wanted to kind of see what else was out there for me 10 years from then.
Well, not just that. For those people who are not in the restaurant industry, it is a very specific way of life.
Very well said.
I mean, it is not. It is not for the faint of heart.
True.
It is not for those if they have partners whose partners aren't on board. If they have children, my son is at Silver Lion. Mm-hmm. He's one of the bartenders there, and he loves it.
Right.
And he was in management before, mm-hmm. At Red Hen and stuff.
Yeah.
But he wanted to really be behind the bar,
yeah.
and he's getting home at 3 or 4 in the morning,
yep.
and that is a lifestyle choice.
It really is.
As a work lifestyle.
Hard. Yeah. So I think I was at the point where I was like, well, I think there is my physical life in this part of the wine world. I think I've got a life expectancy, so to speak. So
mm-hmm.
I wanted to kind of see what else was out there. And I started just, as reading the same set of almost interview questions to everybody else I knew locally in the wine business that wasn't doing restaurants. Mm-hmm. I was just taking folks to coffee that worked for distributors, that worked for importers, that worked for, who were writers, who like anything else I could find. And just said, what do you like about your job? What don't you like about your job? Did you see yourself doing this 5 years ago? What do you think you'll be doing in 5? Like all those, somewhat standard interview kind of questions. And it was just through one of those conversations where my name was thrown into a hat to work for an importer, for a supplier mm-hmm. Called European Cellars. And they are doing Spanish and French wine for the most part. Really great stuff. Eric Solomons has been the owner for 30 some years now and is, really kind of pioneered a lot of that wine mm-hmm. coming into the country. And I hopped on a plane, went to Charlotte and was offered a gig on the way back to the airport. And I was like, okay, well, let's give this a shot. And so I worked for Eric for, about 7, 8 years. And then the opportunity came up to work with the Skurnik portfolio, which is,
give us a little background on Skurnik.
Yeah.
Because I read their history. They're very good at telling their story. Mm-hmm. That it's this family-run business, started with the mom and dad.
Yep. So it was, so Michael and Harmon Skurnik are brothers up in New York City. Mm-hmm. And back in the 80s really were, literally just carrying bags, working the streets, and slowly started building an import portfolio. Wait,
I'm going to back you up.
Yeah.
Explain, you mentioned importers mm-hmm. and you mentioned distributors.
Right.
For the faint at heart or the lay person. Sure. What does that mean, and how does that wind up to what's on our table?
So in most states, I think Maryland's a really good example. Close by. DC's tough to use as an example because
Montgomery County is
we're a little
total pain in the ass,
so we're a little bit of a wild card. But
Oh, right, because DC's laws are totally different.
Exactly. It's kind of the Wild
you could
West
just
here.
bring in
Yeah.
wine. Yeah, it's so easy. Right.
So Maryland is pretty typical in a lot of ways.
Okay.
And for a lot of the country. So that works in what most call a 3-tier system. So I, as an importer, can't sell directly to the WineLair, unfortunately. I can't walk in and say, here's this cool bottle of wine, buy it. They write a check to my company. Unfortunately, doesn't work that way. So what happens is I sell the wine as an importer to a distributor. In our case here, actually, our mutual great friends, Mike and Chris at Prestige LaDroit. Exactly. So they're our local distributor. So we essentially sell the wine to them, who then can sell the wine to the WineLair.
Okay. But so they're the ones, so they're the distributor.
Right.
You're the importer. So the distributor is the one who comes, let's say, to the WineLair and says, here are the wines you want to try.
Right.
This is what we're bringing in. But you, since they're your distributor, as the importer, do you have to sort of sell your wines to them? Not sell like money wise, but like, do you say, hey, we just got this fabulous wine from the Bordeaux region. We think you guys should be carrying it. Or are they like, what do you got? Like, how does that work?
It's a little bit of both. Some of it is, there's parts of our portfolio that, are very, like our champagne portfolio is kind of a thing that's, our company is very well known for. So we're, in that case, essentially it's like, what can we get? Right. There's a lot of that. But every once in a while, we've got producers that are new to our book or things that are new to, newer regions. Like we just brought on a Hungarian producer. So that's a producer that like this year sometime, I want to make sure that I present to Mike and Chris and we talk about that. And it's where it might fit in not only to their portfolio, but where it might fit into this market. Where does it fit into DC restaurants and shops and in Maryland shops and stuff like that? So there's a little bit of both of that. And then there's the other side of it that's not the distributor facing side where is a little bit more of, managing the logistics and a lot of, that fun living in front of Excel to some extent,
Right. But I also assume you get to travel quite a bit and get to meet this wine. I mean, you get to hear their stories and, learn about their products.
Right.
Taste their products, obviously. Yeah. So I assume that there is the shiny side and the non-shiny side.
Always, yeah. And I think a good way to think of it, in a way I've always, because both suppliers I've gotten, importer suppliers I've gotten to work for, I really do feel like my first job is being an advocate more than it is being a salesperson. I'm a pretty shit salesperson. Like I'm not, like it's something that I have never really, I would rather give you all the information and tell you some stories and let you.
And you figure it out.
And if you like the wine, then great. Right. If not, we'll find something else. That's cool too. But really it's, and again, I've been very lucky to work with importers that work with a lot of very small producers, like a lot of very small families that, it's most of these, I tell folks, I'm like, if you call this winery, somebody's going to answer the phone, not in English and probably with the last name and that's on the bottle. Like it's going to be that kind of familial sort of situation. And a lot of that takes some advocacy. Like it's.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, isn't it really hard when you think of wine groups or people who own, like we have Veuve Clicquot here. It's a gorgeous wine. Don't get me wrong, but they have massive budgets in order to most people who drink champagne know it.
Well, when we talk, and that's a great kind of conversation to have because we look at a producer like this. I'm going to turn this. So Gaston Chiquet, producer.
I thought it was Veuve Clicquot.
That's okay, but actually, what's cool is that gives us the cool way to say compare these two.
I thought that. Oh my god, can we cut that? Okay, no, go ahead.
No, so Gaston Chiquet is.
So this is a grower
champagne.
Sure.
So like kind of that's the very generic term for a producer that literally is the farmer. And they're harvesting those grapes, and then they're making wine out of them. Where that's like you take something like Veuve Clicquot or Dom or any of these really big houses, and they're buying all that fruit. They usually own some fruit too, but like they're buying a lot of grapes and then making wine in a house style. So, which again, those wines can be exceptional. You're probably right.
We're sitting here. I'll take your mic.
Looking at it's pretty rough.
I will see it here. Hold your mic and help you out while you're doing that. And while you're popping it. No, I mean, I got a real grower's education. I mean, obviously between Foodie and the Beast and this show, we've had winemakers from all over the world on both. And, the grower's story is so great. And that's really where I learned about these massive budgets and what that, you can make it pop. I know you're not supposed to.
It's instinct.
I know. Every psalm is like, no, you're not supposed to pop it. But here, let's hear that.
That's a good sound. There we go.
That's a gorgeous sound. Thank you. That's lovely.
So we're.
So tell me a little bit about this particular grower
Sure.
and why it's a great wine and a great story that you want to share
Right.
as an importer.
Well, like with this producer, cheers, by the way.
Sure. So good to see
So
you.
this is Gaston Chiquet is a producer in the Marne Valley, in a region called or a little town called DZ. And what's kind of cool is that he is, like a lot of these families, they've been doing this for quite a while, and he's got about 23 hectare, which honestly in our neck of the woods, like for our portfolio, is pretty big. We've got some that have 3 or 4 hectare, tiny itty bitty places. But,
so this is not a single vineyard wine.
Correct. This is but it's all his fruit. So everything he grows here. And this is about half Pinot Noir. There's some Chardonnay in here, a little Pinot Meunier. And what makes this pink, though, is that there's red wine blended back in.
Oh,
yeah.
So I have to tell people, if you are watching us on YouTube, the thing that's fascinating with this is that it looks like it's going to have some residual sugar on the back end, especially because of the color. Right. There's none.
Yeah.
This is the driest
very dry
champagne that I have. And this is champagne?
Yep.
Right? So it's from the region.
Yep.
So most people know this, but for those who don't,
sure.
will you just explain sort of the designation of champagne, how it works in France, and then how it works in other countries?
Yeah. So
and then I'm going to drink some.
The Champenois are maybe the most, they're incredibly well known for this, and maybe, because of their being very litigious and wanting to preserve sort of the character of what comes out of their region. It is a region in France that is known for making sparkling wine, and that's legally what they, that's why you can't call sparkling wine from other places champagne in any way, shape, or form anymore. Even down to the point where it was method champenoise for that traditional method of making sparkling wine, where in most
other people were doing that.
Other regions were calling it.
California, I think there was I think I remember the name, but there was a sparkling out of California, and they had method champenoise on it, and that started a problem, right? Yeah.
So now everything, if you want it, you can call it method traditionnel or something like that. You can call it something else, but you can't have the mention of the champagne or champenoise on there.
Right.
So they get a little itchy about that stuff.
Okay.
But
they're French.
Right.
And it's their product.
And the champenois are even maybe more so than most regions. Like they've even got their own, and most do have some regions have some sort of governing body. But the
like the DOCG
exactly.
in Italy.
In Champagne, they're even a little bit more involved. Like they actually control the amount of each harvest is able to be used for vintage wines, how much is able to be used for reserve wines, how much has to be tossed out to make vinegar. Like they have a hand in a lot more than a lot of other regions.
But what about with champagnes? What about like the kind of grape that can be in there? Is that really structured?
It is, but it's...
Because I always thought that like it had to be more Chardonnay, or
it depends on the part of what part of the region we're in.
Okay.
But that's going to be more about almost like any region, like what's going to dominate, what's going to dominate the dominating grape, or what's going to make the dominating grape is what grows best in that area. So you've got some places they can grow up to, I think it's 7 varieties they're allowed to use, but we only really see Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Meunier are really the big 3.
Okay.
More Meunier now than we've seen. That seems to be growing in plantings.
Is that a climate change thing?
It is a big climate change thing. It stands up better for
But that's not something we drink. Like we don't see a lot of that grape
by itself.
Very
rarely. There's a handful of producers. It has been, although it makes really cool wine. Like there are some producers making it as still wine. There are some producers making 100% sparkling wine out of Meunier, which is exceptional too. But we're thankfully starting to see more of it because it does have a really cool character, and it's.
So can we talk about what makes it sparkling?
Yeah.
So you get the juice from the grapes. Do you play with the taste of the juice first and then make it sparkling? Like what's the process?
Yeah. So a little bit of both. So typically for regular blanc champagne, for regular white wine, you make a regular old still white wine, and then you let that, you ferment that dry, bottle that, and then in that second, basically you've got one more shot to get to adjust where you want that sweetness.
Okay.
And you're adding, so when you add that second hit of yeast to get the second fermentation in the bottle, which is what gives you the bubbles,
right?
That gives you your opportunity also to see how much sugar you want left in the wine. So essentially you're doing a little math equation that says, okay, I'm using this much yeast per bottle, and I know that the yeast will eat this much sugar over the amount of time until the yeast dies off.
I see like a Pac-Man in my
very
head,
much so.
right?
And eventually that Pac-Man's full and it dies.
Right.
So whatever sugar is left is going to be what's left in the finished bottle. So that is kind of that's the one winemaker's chance.
Just to be clear for people, this is not added sugar. It is the natural sugar, right? Or are they adding sugar?
You're actually adding sugar, but it's not necessarily like cane sugar.
Right. It's not it's not like,
there's a bunch of ways to do it.
Visual, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, sparkling wine, there's a lot of wine regions and a lot of styles of wine where it's very hands-off. Sparkling winemaking, champagne as being one of those is not. It's very hands-on. There's a lot you have to do. There's a lot that the winemaker has to kind of be a part of and make decisions about, more than just saying, okay, we're going to let the yeast that came in off the farm run its course. That's what we got. Let's bottle it and roll with it. Which makes amazing wine too. We've got so many cool organic and biodynamic producers out there that just are doing it quite literally that way. Here, you gotta do a little bit more work. You got to sort of make these decisions of what do you want in the final product? How much color do you want in your rosé?
Well, let's talk about this wine specifically.
Yeah.
Like what did they want?
Yeah.
And then how, as the importer,
right,
how do you share this story with a prestige LaDroit?
Sure.
Right. And then, other than obviously being on my show, but how does it get either to the retailer or to the restaurant, and then they too are able to share why this is such a special wine?
Right. Well, there's a few ways in that. Like, I think what makes this bottle incredibly special is that this producer has really amazing holdings. Like Nicolas Chiquet is just also an incredible technician for how he makes wine. And what's a little bit special here, I think, though, where we see a lot of champagne is not vintage dated. Like we see,
that's true.
A lot of it's multi-vintages or non-vintage.
And for people who don't understand that, that's just when the juice is made, right?
Yeah, yep. Okay. So a lot of times producers will make more still white wine or still wine that they are going to make in the champagne than they're going to use in that vintage. And they blend that back in over the next handful of vintages. And it really helps make a house style. It helps helps to sort of cover some dodgy weather maybe for certain vintages, that kind of stuff, and really kind of homogenizes your house style, which is a cool thing, which is something we don't see. Usually we celebrate vintage variation. And a lot of times in champagne, we want the houses, we want Bollinger to taste like Bollinger.
Right.
Things like that. So in this case,
I would think in growers that it's not supposed to be the same every
not
year,
always.
right?
Yeah. So that's what's kind of cool. So, and this is a great example of it, where this is mostly, or I should say, this is all one vintage except for the red wine that makes it pink. So, which is a little bit odd. So the wine, even though it's coming from different grapes, all comes from one vintage. And then in this case, about 10% of this wine is red wine added back into it. Still red wine.
That is fascinating to me, because you can correct me because I'm probably wrong, but I don't feel like you see a lot of that in a rosé sparkler.
There's a couple different, there's really two ways to make rosé. Okay. You can either do the method we're just saying, which is literally blending red wine in, gives you a lot of control over how much, and it's usually that's a dry, still red wine. So you get a little bit more power, a little more structure like you would out of a red wine. Doesn't always change the color a ton, but it always, gives you a little bit more presence. The other way to do that is also to what they call the Sommelier method, to make maceration, basically. Same way you'd make red wine, but in a much shorter time period. So instead of letting those grapes sit on the skins for, days, for example, you might just do it for, 12, 24 hours, something like that. And then bleed it off. That's where the Sommelier like blood. Like you're bleeding the juice, bleeding the juice off of it, where it's just picked up a little bit of color. And that's, so you're also getting some texture though too. For the same reason that, still rosés or red wine has a little bit more texture, a little bit, obviously that's where tannin's coming from, all that other stuff. So then we've got these two ways of making it, both of which, if you let Sommelier rosés sit on the skins for a long time. You can have them be almost like red wines. You can have them be really sturdy and muscular, or you can have them be really, really pretty and ethereal and just have that really almost like onion skin pinkness to them.
It is really
everything in between,
right?
Yeah.
How mad scientist it all is,
right? And that's and sparkling wine is one of the only places we see that, because, like I said, winemaking is usually so hands off comparatively. When you've got great producers in kind of quote standard red wine production, most great producers are very proud to say that they intervene very little. Where here you kind of have to. It's like it's mad scientist work. You really do sort of take these things, all these elements, and you kind of get to build the wine the way you want it. And so taking somebody like Nycci Nellis, who has this amazing base product, he's got this amazing fruit that comes off of his vineyards. And then from there, especially with the rosé, he gets to say, well, I want it to be, because of what we've got in the base wine, I want this rosé to have a little bit more structure in this release, or I want it to be a little less, the wine's a little sturdy already. I'm not going to use as much, reserve red wine here. But so yeah, I just think rosé for that reason, I think sparkling rosé is so fascinating, because you're taking a style of winemaking that's already has a lot of cool inputs, and you're adding even more
to
decisions and cool prospects to.
But I also assume with the sort of value of rosé in general. I mean, 20 years ago, there were no rosés, and now I think I have a lot to do with it because I drink mass quantities of rosé. Rosé is everywhere. Thanks to Wines of Provence, who had a tremendous marketing campaign and spent a lot of money to make sure we knew what rosé is. But I think it's changed the value of rosé champagnes as well, which may have been seen either as a sweet champagne, absolutely, right? Like just without knowledge.
Well, I think before when we first started talking about bubbles and stuff before we went on today, we were saying how you've got these misconceptions of styles of wine, and I think a lot of times, like when there was a lot of that cheap red Italian bubbly that was.
Are we talking about Lambrusco? Because I can't stand Lambrusco.
There's good versions of it. I know, but you're right though. There's a lot of really bad stuff.
Every time one is poured for me, just from looking at it, I feel like my teeth are going to be purple.
But unfortunately, that's how a lot of people, when they see a bottle like this on the shelf,
well,
for the longest time, people would think, oh, that's going to be sweet. Like,
I mean, listen,
like Lambrusco.
It looks like it's going to be really full fruit.
Yeah.
This bottle. Yeah. It does. It's a darker pink.
Yep.
And, my head says, I'm going to get sugar on the back end. That's where my head goes. Yep. And I am not a wine expert, but I drink a lot of wine. Right. So that's where my head goes on it. But the fact that there's none, that it's bone dry is amazing. Yeah. But let's sort of take that. Sure. So let's talk about these other sparklers.
Yeah.
And I've talked about this in other shows about the fact that, if we talk about Lambrusco, Prosecco, sparkling from California, Cava. But I do think Cava and Prosecco get sort of like when they sort of were largely launched here in the States as a less expensive alternative to French champagne, that they, in order to appeal to the American market, they made them sweet.
Yeah.
There's so much sugar in them.
And I think because of them marketing wise and sort of what we had access to for a long time in this country, I think those producers and those appellations really unfortunately kind of painted themselves in a corner with how those wines are perceived now still. You can buy exceptional Prosecco and exceptional Cava at every price point we were talking about before.
Right.
But unfortunately, it's really hard. It's tough for both a retailer and a sommelier, let alone the consumer as well, to walk in and be like, well, why am I going to pay $50 for a bottle of Cava when I can buy a bottle of Cava for $12? Right. Like, I don't, so it's hard. Like, it's even harder because champagne, the sort of the entry is going to be a good bit more.
It's going to be pricey.
Yeah. You're going to spend $40, $50 walking in to buy a bottle of champagne almost anywhere now. And then, but like, to find cava at that price point, it seems like, well, why would I buy that? Why would I
But
spend
I think
that much?
but honestly, I think it takes us back to earlier in our conversation where you were like, if there is a $30 bottle of wine on my wine list, it is because I think that brings value to my wine list and it is a decent bottle of wine.
Exactly.
Same thing with a cava. I'll never forget. And
if there's expensive cava on the list,
there's
it's there
reason,
for a reason.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'll never forget Tail of Goat of all places. I mean, I know we already brought up Bill, but I'll never forget being at Tail of Goat. This is years ago. And there was like a rosé on the list that was like $165.
Right.
And I was like, and I was with people in the biz and we were all like, I mean, $165. But you know, he came over and God love him. He sold it. We're like, we'll take that bottle. We'll do it.
Exactly.
And we did.
Yeah.
And it was fabulous.
Incredible. Yeah.
But you know, you have perceptions. Rosé should not be more than $40 or whatever it is. Do you know what I mean? Because of what sort of we're easily swayed by.
Yep.
Okay. I don't want to leave this show without talking about.
Yeah.
So last year at this time, there was a champagne shortage. It's really hard for me.
It was
it was tough.
It's the worst of times.
So where are we with champagne shortages? How did that affect? I'm sure the big houses were not as affected. Or I mean, I know their stuff was hard to get.
Right.
But like, how does that affect the smaller producer? And how does it affect you, the importer, to getting their product to market?
Sure. Well, this was a situation, that started kind of as the pandemic started. And
was it because of the pandemic or was it just did all the stars align at the right time?
It was a little perfect storm, unfortunately.
Okay.
But the pandemic really did kick off a big piece of this where, everybody was worried. Obviously, in the we were talking about the governing body in Champagne.
Right.
They were worried too. So they actually throttled back the amount that the producers were going to make that year, basically. So which
is weird. Was it because people couldn't socialize, couldn't be together because of COVID? Or do you know what I mean? Like, what was the cause of it? Because from an agricultural perspective, the product is still growing.
True. But then, I think they were, to some extent, they were like, well, we want to look out for the producers. And to some extent, the big producers are a big piece of this, where it's less expensive all across the board if they're going to harvest all that fruit to put, let's say 70% in tank and only 30% in bottles, because they don't have to buy 70% of those bottles now. So there's a big piece of that kind of, and corks and all the other pieces that go along with it, let alone the labor to take care of all that. So they thought like, okay, we're going to help everybody out here. We're going to, they're going to have to make less wine this year. The market's going to be quiet. They're making some predictions that didn't always pan out. So then fast forward, it almost, not I wouldn't say it turned out to be opposite, but definitely people weren't going out to eat as much. They weren't going on vacation. So they had some extra money and they were just like the ones who were buying the $12 cavas and the cheap Proseccos. Now we're like, let's buy a bottle of champagne now. So all of a sudden the market kind of blew up a little bit and there was no wine to serve it. And that was partly because producers had less wine in their inventories because they had so much more wine sitting in reserve. They, corks were more expensive. Glass was more expensive. Transportation, shipping, all that stuff just became so nutty. The same things that were affecting everything were affecting champagne. And then, sort of the CIVC, who's that governing body, sort of turned the taps back on the next vintage. But, it was in a way a little too late because in 21, there were some serious weather issues. So that was, it was almost like,
oh yeah, you want your champagne? Yeah. Good luck with that.
Mother Nature was like, hold my beer.
Right.
And so it was bad. So that's what we kind of dealt with last year was having to, a smaller amount of wine to work with because there was just less wine made. Like there was much smaller yields generally for even producers like this. We're talking like Gaston Chiquet. We're talking about, where a lot of that wine is, from vintages. So just a little less wine to work with. So, and then come to, that's where we still are now. So now we're kind of, working our way through that problem. 2023, as far as sales go and for all of us involved, is going to be a lot like last year. It might be a little better. There is hope on the horizon. The 24 should be a whole lot easier for all of us. We've got producers that basically have caught up in the wines that they've been aging starting this year, basically, will then be available. So we'll have, the the taps to the global market will kind of open up again for us. But unfortunately, we're dealing with almost probably another year of challenges with inventory, just trying to get wine for people. And, it's really hard to tell people you can't have more of that. Like we don't, there's no more. Like it's such a strange thing to have. Like
it is
across the board for champagne.
It is a strange problem to have. I mean, I'm totally and completely with you. I think the whole structure is very fascinating to me, and how these things just fell away. It's interesting.
Yeah. So I think, that being said, and seek out the producers you enjoy. I really think, those producers are making wine. They still are bringing wine to the country. Like we want to make sure that, we're being good about, sticking with the folks that we love their wines. But when you can't find them, don't stop drinking wine, or don't stop drinking sparkling wine either.
But wait, let me ask you a question as we begin to wrap up.
Yeah.
So how do you recommend, I think this is a good way to sort of wrap this up. So how do you recommend to maybe somebody like me, like I know what I like. I wouldn't consider myself I would consider myself an educated wine consumer.
Right.
But like, I didn't know about this particular grower champagne. So where would you pinpoint somebody like me, or people who are interested in dipping their toes in to broadening their wine drinking horizons, to learn about Gaston and other places like that, so that it's in our brains when we go to a wine store or we go to a restaurant and we look at the wine list and we're like, oh, I know this.
Right.
So where do you suggest people go to educate themselves?
I think, and I've always thought that the best place to educate yourself are the shops and restaurants you're most comfortable as a guest. Like if going to see Bill at Tail Up is like a comfortable place for you and you like the way Bill talks about wine, say, these are the things I like. Bill will tell you off of his list and what at the corner store that you should probably buy, which is so fun. Like, I would seek out and take advantage of the professionals that and that you enjoy how they talk about wine and how they share wine. And I think kind of at a more logistical level, you can buy champagne anywhere in DC now. Like after COVID, you can buy, thankfully the restaurants are able to sell and things like that. So, go see Elliot Aparo, and who knows more about champagne than almost anyone I know.
Yeah, she's really, so that was Ellie at Aparo, which is in Georgetown, or Upper Georgetown.
Yeah.
And it's a darling little champagne bar.
You would think of it as a champagne bar, but
they have a great menu.
And they've got great food, but she can also just talk to you about champagne and tell you what you think. Hey, I usually drink, Veuve Clicquot. Take any major producer, and she'll say, well, if you like that, you might like these other folks. And I think those, like, building that, and then the other little kind of trick within the trade that you may play with every once in a while is turn the bottles over. Find importers that you trust. Like find suppliers and importers that, almost every time I turn over the bottle that I've enjoyed and I see, quote, the Skurnick name or something like that in this case. Like, our champagnes, in my opinion, are all really fantastic producers with really cool family stories. And so I feel, if you turn over the bottle, you see Skurnick's name on there, you can feel pretty good that you're getting a really great bottle. Stylistically, that's when you need a little more guidance maybe. And again, that's when you want to lean on your local shop people.
You bring up a great point. Knowing the importers it's a piece.
Yeah, it's worth.
It is a piece. I don't think a lot of people think that way.
Yeah.
But for the more educated consumer, it probably makes sense.
It does. And I think it's really, it's very helpful. I think it's one more piece, and you'll see that, like, once you start doing it, you'll find yourself doing it more often, and you'll start to see trends in your buying and your drinking, which I think is kind of cool.
That is cool.
Yeah.
All right. We could go down like 16 other rabbit holes, but it's only an hour show. So, tell everybody, please, where they can find you. I don't know if you're online or if you're on Instagram, where we can find more about Skurnick. Give us the 411.
I'm terrible at social media personally.
Because it's annoying, but go ahead.
But Skurnick does have a pretty fantastic media presence. So Skurnik Wines, we have Facebook, there's Instagram, there's Twitter, all the standard fare.
Skurnik, Skurnick. Okay, Skurnik Wines.
Yep, and that's again at all the major socials have. We've got presence on all of them, and so that's the best way to find us and me. You can probably find me at your corner bar sitting somewhere. having a bottle of
Well,
wine.
Matt, it is a total treat to see you again and sit and
Absolutely.
chat with you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for today.
That's a pleasure.
I'm just going
Thanks.
to wrap up the show if you'll hold on for one sec. So I want to thank you all for joining me back on Industry Night. Sorry you can't dig into this delicious wine that we're drinking here. And it's always so good to catch up with old friends and really talk about sort of the industry and the business. Now, everything you heard here today can be found on the listoryyouwantit.com. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, any social media platform, at NYCCINELLIS. Of course, you want to listen to Foodie and the Beast every Sunday at 11 a.m. on 1500 a.m. And you can subscribe to everything. Go to YouTube, Industry Night with Nycci Nellis. Please subscribe. And same thing with all the podcast platforms. I'd love for you to like it. I'd love for you to subscribe. And let's get some comments going. Start asking some questions because I can definitely get you answers. Let's start engaging a little bit more. And I promise to be a little more active on my social, even though it really brings me down. And lastly, I want to thank you all for joining us. And as I tell you on every show, and as you heard here today, supply issues are still happening. And there are major staff shortages, not just locally, but nationally. And it's not just in restaurants, it's in all businesses. So take your kindness bill, please. Just remember, nobody wants to argue. Nobody wants to fight. If you do, go to the bathroom and argue in the mirror. Just be kind out there. Thanks again for joining me. Get some great grower champagne and have a delicious week.
Produced by Heartcast Media.